the rabbis dispute whether you actually need to fast for the 10th of Tevet. The real question is, are we in a time of need? And the answer is yes, and therefore you should not have time to eat your sandwich. Go do something for someone who's starving, for someone who is suffering.
This is the Book of Life. I'm Heidi Rabinowitz. My Jewish Year, 18 Holidays, One Wandering Jew, is Abigail Pogrebin's account of a personal year-long experiment. Raised as a semi-observant Jew, she delved into the background, meaning, and experience of observing every single Jewish holiday to the letter. I last spoke with Abigail on the Book of Life podcast in October 2006 about her book Stars of David, in which prominent Jews talk about being Jewish. You can find links to both books at bookoflifepodcast.com. Abigail, please tell us about my Jewish year.
Well, I had been a Jew without education, if that makes sense. I had been raised with Jewish ritual in the home, Shabbat candles and a challah when we were home on Friday nights. My mother cared about Hanukkah and created a wonderful ritual of lighting the menorah and having a Hanukkah party. We did go to the high holiday services at a synagogue, but I didn't belong to a synagogue. I didn't go to Hebrew school. I was not a bat mitzvah. So I missed kind of the infrastructure of Jewish liturgy and education and ritual and Hebrew. And, it didn't bother me really until I had my first child, Benjamin, and I was going through Jewish rituals without really being able to explain why I was doing those rituals. So, for instance, he had a bris, which is the traditional way of obviously welcoming a Jewish boy. It was very moving, but I realized looking at this tiny little person in a very small yarmulke that I was going to want to be able to explain why we made this decision, and I really didn't have the tools or the language. It's really what led me to write Stars of David, where I interviewed over 62 Jewish Americans who had achieved a great deal but not necessarily held on to their Jewish connection. And that book took me to synagogues and JCCs and federations around the country. I began to be more curious about not just Jewish life, but Jewish learning. And I kind of became a study addict. I went to various classes. I audited classes at Jewish Theological Seminary, at an independent yeshiva or seminary called Machon Hadar in New York. Kind of the more I learned, the more I wanted to know, and it began to really have an effect on me. So it's a long way of saying the holidays were still, for me, where the rubber meets the road in terms of not just Jewish knowledge, but Jewish practice and Jewish meaning. You have this calendar that really is the spine of a Jewish life or a Jewish year. And I had never explored what it's like to hit every mark, to do every ritual, to recite every prayer, to understand the underpinnings of these holidays. And that's why I decided to do a deep dive. Frankly, I wasn't sure where it would take me. I originally wrote this for the Forward, a newspaper over 100 years old. And I wrote it in real time. I kept up with the Jewish holidays. I would prepare for the holiday before it arrived. Then I would experience it, and then I would go home and write about it. It was a very challenging but very exciting year. When a publisher approached me about it becoming a book, I went back to my notes and my research, and I took an even more immersive look at what all these holidays had taught me. The result is this book.
So this was a really intensive experiment. How did you go about it? What did you have to do to get ready? How did you follow up on it? How did you prepare for this experience?
I would say I am a kind of meticulous reporter that comes from my days at 60 Minutes and before that for Charlie Rose and at public television for Fred Friendly. The discipline that I was raised with as a journalist is that you over-prepare. So I first of all, read every major book that digests all the holidays, and there were two in particular that guided me more than others. Michael Strassfeld's book called The Jewish Holidays, and Yitz Greenberg, Rabbi Irving Greenberg, who's Yitz for short, wrote a book, I think it's called The Jewish Holidays. I'm blanking on the exact name. But then there was also plenty of essays and articles that I would Google, and one thing leads you to the next thing, leads you to someone's sermon, leads you to someone's article, leads you to someone's essay. I listened to sermons. Sometimes I would be on my bicycle or taking a walk or even doing yoga, listening to people's sermons on various holidays. So I did a lot of preparation before a holiday would arrive. I also reached out to rabbis whom I've kind of collected over the years just because I'm a big fan. It was one of the most magical parts of this experience is that no one turned me down. Very busy people made time to talk about Shemini Atzeret or Purim or Shavuot. And that was honestly quite powerful just by itself.
So you're bringing up something that I wanted to touch upon. You spoke to many, many experts during this journey. Tell us about a conversation you had that was particularly meaningful or interesting.
One was very surprising, which was about the 10th of Tevet, one of the winter fasts, the fast that marks the siege of the temple, which is the first stage of destruction. And I spoke to Ethan Tucker, one of the founders of Machon Hadar, the independent seminary on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And what Rabbi Tucker talked to me about is that this was a fast that the rabbis dispute whether you actually need to fast for the 10th of Tevet. So in the Talmud, he explained, they say that if we are in a time of persecution, you need to fast. If you are in a time of peace, you don't. And the rabbis argue about whether we are in a time of persecution or peace. And even to this day, some rabbis dispute whether it's an obligation, because some would say we are in a time of peace because Israel exists. And others say that if you look at the world, there is so much persecution, and even in Israel, things are not settled at all. And for many other reasons, we are still in a time of what they call shemad. That is the Hebrew term. So we should be fasting. And that was just such a fascinating discourse because it makes me think, what do I think? Are we in a time of persecution or peace? And what do those words mean today? His ultimate takeaway was the real question is, are we in a time of need? And the answer is yes. And therefore you should not have time to eat your sandwich. Go do something for someone who's starving, for someone who is suffering.
What a great answer.
I thought it was too.
What was it like to observe unfamiliar holidays?
It was actually very challenging to observe unfamiliar holidays, partly because I think prayer is challenging by itself. And it's especially hard when it's for a holiday that's a little hard to get a grip on symbolically. Probably the hardest was Hoshana Rabbah, which is the penultimate day of Sukkot. It's really a holiday that, number one, asks for rain for the harvest. Also, though, the rabbis teach that it's actually the day that the gates close from Yom Kippur, that judgment is actually extended that extra time that we didn't know we had, where we can maybe alter our verdict. Because, we are pleading with God or pounding our chest during Yom Kippur, thinking that the gates are going to close when the sun goes down and we end our fast. And it turns out we actually had a little more time to maybe adjust the decree. That was a fascinating idea to me because to me it's very Jewish in a way that they're saying, yes, this is the moment where you have to atone for your sins. And then it's like my Aunt Helen saying, you know what, Abby, take a little more time. You got a little more time. So I love that teaching.
Did observing unfamiliar holidays change how you felt about the familiar ones?
That's a great question. Absolutely. And partly because I didn't realize how they're all linked. The unfamiliar holidays are completely connected to the familiar ones. That's the beauty of this calendar. I'm ashamed to admit, I honestly used to think that some of these holidays were non sequiturs. Suddenly, everything linked to everything else. It wasn't necessarily obvious how, but that's what part of these conversations led to, where was the connective tissue between them, and that had great power for me.
So I know you learned a lot throughout this experiment. Can you tell me something really weird that you learned, something really beautiful that you learned, something really surprising?
Yeah. I would say first that was beautiful was the idea on Simchat Torah, when we complete the full Torah cycle and start the next one, that part of the takeaway of that celebration and the fact that you have everyone dancing with this scroll, which is usually very, not just sacred, it's always sacred, but it feels almost fragile. We use a yad. We don't touch it with our hands. We certainly don't dance with it, let alone hold it ourselves. It stays in the ark. And suddenly these sacred scrolls are essentially on the dance floor, and people are passing them and dancing exuberantly and making these circles. You're supposed to do these 7 hakafot, these 7 circuits around the perimeter of the synagogue. And I went to BJ B'nai Jeshurun in New York, which is known for this incredible celebration. And literally it was like the floor was pounding, dancing in conga lines and lifting up the scroll and passing a talis from one person to another, encouraging people to hold this book. And one rabbi said to me, look at us, we're the biggest book group in the world. And it felt more unified, more like that cliche that often I find not to be really true, which is that Jewish people are one people. There were observant, non-observant Jews on that dance floor, and it didn't matter. And another rabbi pointed out that there aren't a lot of Hebrew lyrics that are required. It's lie, 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 lie. Everyone can sing those lyrics. It was like the playing field was leveled. We were all invited, and this was our book together. And that was extraordinarily beautiful to me. I would say in terms of a lesson that was a little bit odd, the costumes on Purim had never been something I really warmed to. It just felt like kind of Halloween in the middle of this holiday that is a fairly serious one. I mean, this was an edict to destroy all Jews. And Esther saved the day and intervened with her husband, the king, and begs him not to execute that decree. It's a really close call. So that doesn't really make sense to me as a time to dress up in crazy costumes and spin these loud groggers and boo Haman. And I know that we're very far from it, and I know that ritual evolves and we should embrace it, but it just didn't sit so well with me. What was even more hard to square, frankly, was that after we were saved, we turn around and kill our enemies. Now, it's not that we're not entitled to. They were going to exterminate us, but essentially we'd won. We'd been saved. This was a decree that actually could not be undone. It was going to be carried out, but we were now emboldened to crush it. What at least one rabbi explained to me is that we're not wholly culpable in the fact that we decided to take revenge on those who were going to kill us. But what we do is kill 75,000 people. And that's in the Bible. And to me, there's a reason why we don't tell that story in Hebrew school. But at a certain point, we need to own that too.
Is there anything about your own Jewish practice that has permanently changed because of this experiment?
I would say absolutely. First of all, my consciousness about what it means to be responsible in the world is something I felt before, but I didn't feel as continually nudged to consider what I owe. And I don't just mean financially or even in terms of my time. I mean in terms of my awareness of what the person next to me or the person across the ocean might be going through, and whether I can have even a small impact to alleviate that pain. That is not being Pollyannish, and I'm not going to say I'm anybody's savior or hero. That I will say that I was not before as aware that that is an almost daily consciousness in our tradition. And certainly in our holidays, even when you're really celebrating, there's either the hidden or very blatant lesson that you should be thinking about the person who has less than you do. The other thing that's changed, in some ways dramatically, in some ways imperceptibly, is Shabbat. I do now power down. I don't look at email. I don't send it or read it. I have an automatic message that just says I'll be looking again on Saturday night. It's a small gesture that has made a huge difference because it reminds me of what it means to make space and that you can actually survive disconnection. I don't go off of text just because of my children. I want to be reachable in some way. But my friends and my other family members know that I really am trying not to be on screens. And it's just changed the way I spend that day. I walk more. I spend time with my husband differently. I read more. I nap more. It really has created breathing room in a way that was honestly promised, but I didn't quite believe until I tried it.
Very cool. How does this book contribute to tikkun olam? How does it help to heal the world?
There's healing. There is repair in coming back to some of our building blocks and saying, why do they matter today? Particularly for a sense of community, makes you realize that we are all tethered by this calendar. It is our glue. I really do believe there's repair in that. I hope that what people get out of it is the repeated urgency and charge to think about someone else. You don't pull up the rope behind you. Someone threw it for us, and we should be looking at who needs it.
Is there anything that you'd like to talk about that I haven't thought to ask you?
I guess the only thing I would say is most Jews I know, and I live in New York City with a lot of them, have never looked at the whole Megillah, the whole menu, whether or not you accept or reject all or any of these holidays. I do think it's worthwhile to pick up one volume and see for the first time what all of them exist for. And then when one decides to reject them or to observe them, it's done with a certain kind of authority and agency that I think not just emboldens all of us, but will affect all of us. I do believe that to understand the Jewish year is to be affected by it.
Abigail Pogrebin, thanks so much for speaking with me.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure, Heidi.
I'm Lisa Newman, Director of Communications at the Yiddish Book Center.
I'm Krista Whitney, the Director of the Yiddish Book Center's Wexler Oral History Project.
I'll be joining you soon on the Book of Life. I'd like to dedicate my episode to all of my colleagues here at the Yiddish Book Center who work so hard to explore, unearth, and keep us all involved in Yiddish culture, and to all of those who are out there listening who are also curious like myself and eager to discover what the roots of Jewishness are.
And I'd like to dedicate my episode to the idea of deep listening. Deep listening is creating a space for people to go deep into their memories and reflections, and also as the listener to really pay attention to what the other person's saying.
If you enjoy the Book of Life podcast, please become a patron at patreon.com/bookoflife. Leave a review on iTunes or a comment on our blog at bookoflifepodcast.com. You can also like our page at facebook.com/bookoflifepodcast. Follow us at twitter.com/bookoflifepod. Email us at bookoflifepodcast@gmail.com or leave us a voicemail at 561-206-2473. The Book of Life is a podcast service of the Feldman Library at Congregation B'nai Israel in Boca Raton, Florida at cbiboca.org and is supported in part by the Association of Jewish Libraries at jewishlibraries.org. Our background music is provided by the Freilach Makers Klezmer String Band. Thanks for listening and happy reading.